Hello, everyone. Thanks to the third session of Shelter in Places, Thinking the COVID Pandemic with the new Center for Research and Practice. My name is Mohammad Salemy. Together with Valentin Golev and Reza Negarestani, we've been hosting these sessions on Wednesday nights to think critically and think politically and think philosophically about what the world is experiencing in this moment. I would like to begin this session with a few remarks of my own. I would like to divide it. First, I would like to talk about this very news that just got dropped on us, which was like Bernie Sanders dropped out of the US race. So I would like to talk about that. And then maybe Jan Groos, who's with us from Vienna, can maybe reflect on that. And then with Eric, they can continue the political conversation. And then I will save my thoughts on the pandemic for a little bit later, because as you know, I've been mostly moderating the last two sessions and not really like putting so much opinion, but I've had some time to think about it. And I thought it's good to also maybe for me to just like put few more things on the table in terms of what I think is happening and what we ought to be thinking and doing at this moment. So about the race, hello, Davor, thanks for joining. We're just waiting for Reza to join. About what just got announced, which is Sanders dropping out, I just think it's the biggest catastrophe for America after the pandemic itself. And I'm very disappointed. I think he should have not dropped out. I think a lot went wrong in the campaign, and I think just with a lot of like left is so good at missing a chance to turn a crisis into an opportunity. And it was just another example of that. Why? Because if Sanders had better advisors, it was really clear long before the first Super Tuesday that coronavirus is going to change the face of the world. If I, in my small little mind as an artist and a curator, already knew that in mid-February, there was no reason for an organized socialist body like a Sanders campaign to not think about how this thing will reshape the election in America. And with the Medical for All message that the Sanders campaign was the main message, this was the best opportunity to double down rather than kind of like step back. And what really burns me is the fact that two things is that Sanders' campaign brought a lot of money from the pocket of people who had so little that gave to it. These money right now is the money that American people are not receiving from their governments. This money was given from every paycheck, like a chunk of a flesh of a body for a good cause. And this is a betrayal by Sanders and his campaign to betray this. And the second thing is that a lot of people who normally would have not entered electoral politics joined because they thought this is the chance. So for these people to either become cold and cynical again, or in a way worse, to be coerced into voting for Biden is just, I don't know which one is worse, becoming more like a radical sectarian left again, or joining the Biden campaign. Which one's worse? Pick your choice, right? So yeah, so this is why I thought this was another one of those great opportunities for the left to basically great crisis opportunities for the left. So I don't know, Jan, what do you think about what I put on the table here? But yeah, I just think, and you know what I mean? I would like to blame it on bad advisors, because Sanders was only a placeholder, almost like a socialist hologram that a lot of ideas and a lot of things he interfaced. So I think it's no use to blame it on his person, but maybe the best is to think about the campaign and the collectivity that basically put the message. And imagine, you know, like all throughout the campaign, the reason why I'm speaking up is that I was one of the diehard Bernie bros out there in the art world, right? But really, that's not how it works. I come from 40 years of political experience in Iran, in Canada. It didn't mean that people who supported Sanders agreed with everything he said or every move, but as long as the movement was alive and it was moving forward, there was no need for takedowns and cancer culturing things he said or did or anything, right? But this is the right moment for the critique to emerge. So I think it's worse to try to defend his decision or defend his mistake or try to mythologize it to this golden Sanders era where there was a rise of socialism and damn Corona destroyed it and all that, right? We really need to be critical of the whole movement, what happened, to learn from it for next time. Because as you guys all maybe saw Washington Post today, there was an interesting kind of like speculative editorial there written from 2025 on the day of the inauguration of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So basically kind of imagine that like Biden would lose the nomination in the second term. No, no, Trump will win, but then Democrats are not able to do anything, and AOC basically pick up where Sanders left off. But I think it was just like a nice gesture of right wing to throw at the left, knowing that Sanders would drop out today, because I was like, why were they publishing this? But anyway, it's a nice piece, and it's a nice thought to think maybe if we learn from this, we can basically apply it to the next race, because this does not make me lose my faith in electoral politics and how it can get radicalized. Personally, I'm talking for myself. Yeah. So what do you think, Jans? Maybe you can.
Yeah, well, I think I'm not the right person to comment on the specifics of the campaign or anything, because I'm not an expert in any way.
Okay, you know what? People. I'm sorry, people don't know you. Let Eric introduce you, because there's a little bit of context. No, context is nice. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. So Jan is a doctoral researcher at the University Duisburg-Essen and was lately a research fellow at the Weizenbaum Institute. And for his PhD, he works on narratives of algorithmic governmentality. He studied art at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. And besides that, he also does the amazing podcast I can recommend, Future Histories, which deals with the intersection of technology, economy, and politics, and aims at expanding our imagination for possible futures. And yeah, Jan, stage is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eric, for this kind introduction. As I was saying, I think I'm not the right person to comment on the specifics of this campaign and what went wrong or went right. But what I do think is that what we are in for is the long game, you know. So of course this is a huge disappointment that Bernie Sanders just dropped out. But I do believe still that he as a figure was really important for the expansion of the collective political imaginary, certainly for the US, but also for someone like me. And I do say that even though he is, for me, something like a classical social democrat, and I actually do have a lot of problems with social democracy in this classical sense, as it is done here in Austria or in Germany, because I'm actually voting for something more. It is called radical, but I would call it more reasonable, actually. So actually, I think he's an important figure for this expansion of the political imaginary, and to kind of make a bridge to the topic of the discussion today. I'm actually interested in discussing today, maybe, and I would like to hear opinions of all of you if this is possible. I would be interested in discussing these battlegrounds of meta-narratives and what kinds of shifts this pandemic maybe can create on that front. And I'm, as Eric just said, I'm very much interested in narratives of governance. And while we, of course, right now do see very frightening elements to this on many fronts during this pandemic in the form of state authority, totalitarian power grabs and surveillance and things like that, I do think that if we look at the meta level of narratives of governance, that whatever the outcome of this actually is, there is a big winner in all of this, and that is contingency. So like years and years and years, we have been told that there is no alternative, and that, for example, markets in combination with the profit motive are the only and best organizing principle of close to all human affairs, actually, and that the state is not only not willing, but also not able to be in the driver's seat in this market-state combo. And I think, of course, there are like different things to be said there. For example, it's super important to point out that this framing of state versus markets or markets versus state as a dichotomy has always been a false one, because this is, of course, this has to be thought of as an entanglement very much. And I think this is like especially important right now, when at least some parts of the left are praising these kinds of state interventions right now as signs of a like, for example, possible planned economy or something like that. And I just briefly talked to Anil before we went online about his talk last time, I think. And what I'm super interested in talking about would be this question of the like cybernetic planned economy in the age of its technical feasibility, if you will, and how this moment might be a opening for this narrative as a like opposing narrative to markets which have clearly failed in this situation, where we can all see that that things who have a definite use value are much of a much higher importance than let's say super complex financial abstractions and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm not sure how.
Let's just like put the two thoughts together. So, you know, the lack of trustable state persons, right?
Ok. Anyway, volevo che mi ha mandato il link per oggi. Comunque ci vediamo.
Okay.
Ciao, ciao.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so you know, like all of this is great, but you know, like the first step, or one of the first steps, or one of the many important steps, is to have trustable or people who are flexible enough to be lobbied in a certain way as statespeople, right? Like as presidents and prime ministers and members of MP. So basically, who's gonna hear us our lovely suggestions about a cybernetic post-corona economy if we don't have people like Corbyn, Sanders, or AOC, or people like that are trustable, or they're flexible enough to be bent if they're lobbied in the right way. When you have people, corrupt people like Biden or Trump, basically they got a chance to reinvent neoliberalism. They're not going to listen to you. They're going to listen to how they can make capital survive. You know, capital's attitude towards corona is very important. Nobody's talking about this. How capital is perceiving this crisis and rethinking about its own reinvention, right? So this is really important. We're not the only people who are thinking about that. People with far more political and economic power are thinking how to utilize this to secure their sort of like future profits and future income and future rent, right? So this is really important, and that's why what happened in England a few months ago with Corbyn and what happened with Sanders is catastrophic, because we got to a level where we could put a few of our trustable or lobbyable people, and then we failed.
Yes, that's certainly true. But I can just repeat that I believe that we are in for the long game. And if Biden now loses against Trump, which is quite sure actually that he will, then this is the second time where the centrist Democrats are shown that their centrist candidate cannot win in this situation. And at some point, they will have this power-preserving instinct that they will have to go with a more progressive candidate. And AOC, you just said it, she is like the obvious next person in line, so to speak. And she will be definitely open for suggestions towards a cybernetic planned economy. I'm quite sure about that. She had already talked about modern monetary theory and stuff like that. So she is quite quite open for these suggestions. And of course, I share your frustration. You know, it is frustrating that we had these moments of a political opening and engagement of especially young people, and that this didn't like lead to a power grab in the state. And yes, it is frustrating, but I'm still actually kind of optimistic, because I think that the situation, it does show many people really on a very like physical level, that the narratives that have been fed to all of us for years and years and years and years, that these are not right, that they are not true, that they are just like narratives that are pushed forward in order to play a specific type of power game. So I do set some kind of hope in this breaking of narratives, and I of course see that there is a logical next candidate after neoliberalism, because I do believe that this narrative of neoliberalism, this is dead. You cannot win elections running with this. Macron was the last one who won an election in this kind of like classic style, you know. And the next logical candidate is platform capitalism, and what Philipp Stab describes in his book. It's called Digital Capitalism, I think. And it is proprietary markets where huge players have a monopoly over a certain field, and they are actually businesses and markets at the same time. And that is going to be a kind of critical infrastructure on many levels. You can see it right now with Amazon certainly being some kind of critical infrastructure thingy, however, whatever the name for this is, actually, I don't know. But many people do rely on Amazon working much more than they rely on, like, I don't know, working. I don't have a good example for this, but it has risen to a level where this is such a huge player that we do have to see it like that, and that we have to ask ourselves how to implement different ways to approach these critical infrastructures in the digital era.
Jan, I have two questions, and I don't know on which one to focus. The first one is the relation between the ideological narrative battle and its relation to the institutional battle of, okay, who has which positions. And I guess this is not a question that one can answer easily, but how one can conceive their, like, simply put, what comes first, or what one should prioritize in a strategy. Is it feasible to actually push simply narrative-wise and simply ideological for a long time, and then having like a huge wave of institutional positions? Or does this have like step by step, okay, narrative, institution, narrative, institution? This is maybe the first. And the second question is about what you just called these huge players in platform capitalism like Amazon. And I was just thinking, if the next logical, if we are not strong enough yet to actually win elections, and that the next logical candidate is probably platform capitalism, that if we couldn't let it be for a little bit of time and develop certain infrastructures that then could be taken over. This is just I'm thinking especially about the Walmart book. I think you've read it, as an idea that, okay, there are certain infrastructures that are transnational, that are international, and that aren't markets in themselves, but which are internally planned economies, and that these should be a primary target in overall strategy. And yeah, maybe I don't have a real good formulated question in this, but maybe like our strategic relation to them, based maybe as a general question. Yeah.
I think the two relate to each other, the two questions actually, and I'd say that what has to happen it has to happen in parallel. You know, it's not. I think it doesn't work that way, that you have a chronological step-by-step guide how to get to I don't know, some form of I don't want to say post-capitalist society. Actually, I have to find a different term for that. But I think it all has to be in parallel, because if you neglect the party politics, someone else will take over, and you lose influence on that front. And what I learned through some of my guests actually in the podcast, Ruspe Taheri, for example, he's the spokesperson of this community initiative to take on these big housing companies in Berlin. And what he said, and what I really like to emphasize is, it is super important that people are brought into positions where they can feel that their engagement does actually make a difference. So this always has to be a part of the whole thing. You cannot only have a reflection of how to proceed in the abstract without connecting to this actual experience of everybody, actually, you know. So I'd say it has to be in parallel, and this is done by people who have different abilities. I'm not suited to do certain things, but I'm suited to do a podcast and try to, you know, manage this discursive arena somehow. And so I will proceed to do this and do my research in the form of the PhD. Other people's like Ruspe, they are having this great thing that tries to mobilize people to do something against the housing conglomerates there. Yeah. So
just shortly, sorry, I just need to think about, I don't know, I guess you know it, this proposal by Graham Jones, his non-reformist reforms, like reforms who increase the ability of bottom-up organizing, and that are not as easily reversible as other reforms, that we should focus on.
Yeah,
just
I'll have to. The next thing that I will definitely have a look at is a more closer look at actually is this idea of universal basic services, because I think that actually an idea like this is the moment for an idea like this. You know, everybody can understand that if we had universal basic services, we would be in a much better position to confront a situation like COVID-19. And this is like easily transportable to everybody. That's also why people pick housing as an example where to fight, because everybody can relate to this topic, you know. And right now, if you try to argue for universal basic services, everybody will be able to relate to this, because it's quite intuitively logical to say that if everybody has housing, eating, and stuff like that for free, and this is done for everybody, then people won't have to go to work even if they're sick. Then the chance of them giving corona to others will, of course, not be there, and stuff like that. So this relation between me and you is now experienced in a very different way, and I think there are many like proposals that will become intuitively logic to many people now.
Thank you so much, Jan.
Could I add something here, which links what Jan's talking about back to maybe the Sanders Corbyn question. So what Jan, I think you mentioned there, which I think is a really good point, is that, you know, democratic socialist initiatives, policies, politics, really good at community organizing. You know, this is what they're about. This is their bread and butter. Local level community organizing. This is where Podemos started, taking over local councils. Had a very clear strategy before going statewide in Spain. This is this is like the main flaw in the Sanders-Corbyn kind of axis, was not creating their own parties. Why? If you want to crack a two-party state, that requires a revolution of the order of the Industrial Revolution. It's the only time the two-party state in that parliamentary parliamentary democracy of the UK ever saw a significant shift. That's the level of change required, you know, when Labour were created. Labour pretty much taking the place of the Whigs at this point. But for a moment, they shifted the dynamics of a two-party state. Now that kind of change, we like to think we're part of a digital revolution. We may not really be living that kind of change just yet. That might still be around the corner. A much better strategy which Podemos took and which Momentum should have taken and roots organizations in the States should have taken is create a party, start working at that local layer and start chipping away. Now, I don't know all the local structures that exist in the American system, but there are local structures in every system. And Momentum could have had real success at the local council level in the UK. It could have had the kind of success Podemos saw 2-3 years ago. Now, where are Podemos today? They're in power in a coalition, putting together proposals like Ingreso Minimal Vital, which is essentially the closest thing any major Western democracy has come to UBI, saying that everyone who earns under a certain amount will have their income topped up. First European nation after the Corona crisis to come up with a solid UBI-like proposal that they have a kind of majority on, and they can actually ram through Parliament, comes from a cabinet which contains Podemos ministers. That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence at all. That's a long-term strategy that is democratic socialist at its core and had a localist focus in its early years. This is what, and you know, both Sanders and Corbyn had world-class roots organizations, whether it's DSA, Momentum, a range of other organizations in the US. Really amazing organizing going on. That should have been leveraged to get local representation for a new party. In both cases, they'd be much further along right now if they hadn't tried to hijack what are essentially centrist parties in two-party states. So I'm not surprised by the outcome. Of course, I'm disappointed. I would have loved it to have pulled off, but at no point did I think it was strategically feasible. Corbyn spent 2 years fighting his frontline.
Fighting? He didn't really fight. He was too polite.
No, but he was under attack from all these elected representatives.
No, they were fighting. Let's put it in the right words. Centrists fought him, and he did not gather enough courage to go after them.
It's not centrist. It's like basically the vast majority of the elected representatives of the party he represented were not on his side. Yes, now that's a losing position, even if you have the membership.
Urge the party because he was too nice to centrists. He did. I mean, we can talk about Corbyn all you want, but I think the major problem of Corbyn, as everyone knows, was that he didn't really take the side of Leave or really he could have taken either of those sides and fought rigorously on that, and he would have done much better. But because he did not want to be Leave or he didn't want to be Remain, he kind of stayed in the middle, and he didn't take on the centrist the way Boris Johnson took on his opponents in his party. He just played nice, and he wanted to have everyone, and this is what happens. And in a way, we can talk about how this was replicated a little bit less with Sanders, but I think, I don't know, I just think, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but I don't think we are understanding or like bringing into our consideration the tectonic shift that this new reality is going to cause to everything we're talking about. It's now clear that this lockdown or like the low-level social life is going anywhere for 1 year or maybe 18 months. And we're basically, today actually I saw it, I went to Frankfurter Allee and I just saw the new normal. But we're living in Berlin. It's very, very, even for the new normal standards, very utopian, right? And it's like we're dealing with a 9/11 situation here, and left completely failed to utilize any of the potentials of 9/11, and because we did not even think how this will rearrange our global world. What we're seeing is another event even larger in magnitude, because even politicians call it the largest global event since World War II. The way Corona pandemic is playing out, it will completely change our world, even deeper than 9/11 and war on terror did, right? So, and I think we really need to, everything we say, we really need to think of these new normal, and how all of these great ideas and all of these like consensus, we have a lot of stuff that we're saying, how are they going to play out in the new normal without factoring the new normal and its limits and the potentials. We're just like, we're still in the old world. We're still talking from, like, you know what I mean? Like you used to say, in today's world. We can't say today's world anymore, because the today's world is yesterday's world. And a new world, we don't even kind of like know what it is to call it, but we no longer can say in today's world. We always now have to say in yesterday's world, which deals with the world and globalization and global capital, neoliberalism, all the way to when the world went down into this lockdown, right? And now we're in this new world. So it would be good if we can maybe move on, and maybe if Brunella, Reza never joined us. I don't know. He must be having an emergency because he's not responding to text or anything. So, but maybe we can kind of like open it up to Brunella. There's been a lot discussed, right? And I think it's a good moment for Brunella maybe to jump in, and then followed by Davor. And also, I just want to say something. Please, if you're not one of the invited guests, if you want to speak, please chat first, and let's find a way. Do not, please, just unmute your microphone and join the conversation, because too many noises and it just makes it like kind of unbearable for viewers and listeners later. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brunella, if you got the floor.
Do you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I would start with this preoccupation of the people in power doing what, how they can take advantage of the situation, etc. I would insert myself with saying that they die too. They are afraid of dying. They are not simply the ones who, they're not the actors and we are the acted upon. There's no difference anymore. This is my starting point. That is the first time that is not comparable to the 9/11. 9/11 was local, so it was perceived differently from there, or from Italy, or from Afghanistan. Afghanistan didn't even know, the Afghani people didn't care, and they didn't know because they didn't have electricity. Now everywhere we are in the same boat, as we say in Italian. And this is my idea that the cybernetic model or narrative can explain and can give us a more concrete sense of where we stand now. That is, it's the first time in which we think while something is occurring, and it is occurring very close or more and more closely to our bodies. So it's a way of thinking that is immediately, constantly, every day embodied. So for instance, in Rome, we don't have many cases, but in Milan, they are in a panic. I heard someone coughing violently this morning, and I entered the panic. So what do we learn from this? That we react cybernetically in the sense of automatically when we are immediatally hit or hurt by something. The contiguity is what makes the difference with anything that has occurred before. Even past plagues were not global. We might, I don't know, people might have had an idea of escaping. Now, where do we escape? You know, in another planet. So this embodied effect, this idea that contiguity makes the difference, levels also the claims of power, whether it is economic power or political power. We have a premier here who is now followed by everyone, because of the emergency. He's very balanced, but he works and acts out of uncertainty. This is why he's criticized, because Of course, the opposition says it should have predicted, but this is the point. There's no prediction possible anymore. So I would use a kind of oppositional logic to show two different attitudes. One could be called the ideological attitude, especially of the left, which belongs to the 20th century, which is what Davor called the old elite. The old elite dies when he imagines this old elite. This is the old elite acting out of a judgment that is predetermined by ideologies. Already Lyotard had deconstructed the grand narratives, but this old elite keeps using the old narratives. Now they are replaced by scientists plus AI, by interpreters of the information technologies. But of course, we whom, you know, these actors acted upon are here, and hopefully we must detect any possible change, any possible paradigm shift in attitude. We cannot say just scientists will solve the problem, of course. We cannot just say education will be interrupted, because this is not feasible, not convenient for everyone. So what is the alternative attitude? It is to consider the immediately previous occurrence that compels for the immediate next reaction or retroaction on the immediate cause. So the old elite used still a causalistic thinking. What is the cause? The capital, power, profit, and this is the effect. What is a virus? An occasion for power. And then we have this circular thinking of going around the cause-effect thinking. What is the cybernetic or systemic model of attitude? It is this keeping at the immediate time space that occurred before, that compels for an immediate action tomorrow. So we have to reduce the expectations, but at the same time to be more effective. The grand predictions must be replaced, not must, sorry, but are being replaced by anticipations. This is what politicians do. This is what our civil society does when we decide to follow the rules. We anticipate what can occur next. So I would also imagine, I would also recall the main metaphor of the old elite, that is a war. We are at a war. We are not at a war. We don't have a representation. We don't have a meaning of what's happening now. We don't have a narrative. And this is the old idea of a war or class conflict. All of this doesn't fit into this attitude. The metaphor that we use, this is what we say in Italian, we are in a sinking boat. That is, in a sinking boat, we do not have time to make any representations. We don't have time to do a narrative. We only have time to do something next. But okay, it's not a war which claims to have some meaning and cause, but we have a battle which needs to be won, and not against an enemy, but inside of an environment. So the first attitude is considering the virus as an object. So the thinker, the philosopher is the subject that is outside of the virus and observes the object out there. The cybernetic attitude is we are inside of the virus, because the virus is everywhere. It is invisible. It is an environment, as if we want to recall the systemic theories, systems theory, the environment is exactly what needs to be absorbed in order to neutralize it. So the virus is an effector. It is not the effect of a cause. Of course, it is an effect of a cause. But what's happening next must, not must, but shouldn't be considered as the great effect of a great cause. In Greek, we have aitia, which means the general cause, and we have kairos, which is the occasional cause. So we are left with occasional causes. We do not have general causes. We cannot generalize. We don't have time. So I think that the old attitude is to consider the possibility to speak, to predict to predict a indeterminate future time. To work or to talk to indeterminate masses of people. I remember Marcuse said the next, he said that in the 60s, the next neurosis will be to talk to the masses. You know, Facebook gives us this illusion that we are constantly talking to the masses. The cybernetic attitude is we have a limited time upon which we must act. We are given deadlines all over the world. We are given deadlines. So we can also generalize and say that some parts of the earth are ahead, some parts of the world are behind. So all of this is globalized. But this ahead and behind is a very limited span of time, very limited span of space, because we observe what's going on the local level. So we are not speaking to the masses, but we are speaking to through real communities. I think this one is one example, one good example of talking to community. This reminds me of Arendt, Hannah Arendt, who said revolutions fail, but there are these vulnerable moments of communities in which everyone is able to speak and to express themselves and to clarify. His philosophy has any usefulness is clarification. So this must be clarified. Talking within a limited time and limited space. So we are speaking, thinking and feeling in lack of references, in lack of representation and narratives, in urgency. So now that
I think Valentin had a question. Do you want to continue on, or you want Valentin to ask question, because it might get expired, the time of Valentin's question?
I can wait for the end. I can listen to the question.
Hello. So the whole situation we are in, we already compared it to World War II and 9/11. And while you say that we experienced it almost at a bodily level, I think like at the bodily level, like when we hear cough, when we sneeze, or when we have fever, it's not some kind of new experience. What we experience, the fear that comes out of it, is a fear that is most like, I mean, for at least a long period before we saw some things in front of our eyes on the streets, maybe some of us, for a long time it was constructed by the media as well. And in this sense, it's still event in some ways resembling, 9/11, because it's very much internet constructed, and it is a power of all of the media to present us with different anticipations. Because yes, now we talk about fear of dying, fear of overcrowded hospitals, but we also talk about famine, right? We also talk about economic crash, which is, yes, I know it's a staple in right-wing politics, but it is linked to extreme poverty levels for disenfranchised population. And when it is said that, we have to act now, we have no time to think, it is again a feature of discourse, a feature of thinking that has long been here, with climate change is real, act now, capitalism is real, act now, like something that, Zizek criticizes a lot. And I think right now we see how many things are being sacrificed because of this very immediate fear of death, right? Very immediate threat to our corpse, to our corporal being, for which we sacrifice so much. Maybe, you know, like, because we don't even think, there was never a moment of reflection, you know, like what would be the actual action here. I think I mean, it's hard for me to imagine what happens in Italy, where it's a much closer experience, I believe, because in Germany people really don't seem to care about this yet.
I think maybe Patricia also
exactly, this is the difference. I don't think that you can compare this situation to the climate change or the economic crisis. And in fact, the media are all focused on the COVID. I don't hear so much about the other problems. So something else that changes is the definition of emergency. Where was the climate change really so urgent? It wasn't so urgent. So I agree with you. It is a mediatic construction, not in the sense that it doesn't exist, but in the sense that it is amplified the same way in which the COVID is amplified. The mediatic amplification worked as an effector because the fear caused the hospital to be emptied of doctors, and they needed more doctors. They did find more doctors. Why didn't they find those doctors before? Because of the fear of death. Climate change, we are not afraid of dying. We are not afraid of dying. It is something that is still theoretical. I'm not saying that it's not true, of course, but we don't have on our bodies the effects of the issue. The issue is an issue. It is a subject matter for discussion. We have time to discuss, even if it is considered as an urgency. Here, we are dying, not in Rome, but they are in Milan. There are places that are ahead. So I don't want to say, anything negative, but, in the United States, the deaths are growing. So what to do? We do not have time to reflect so much. This is not a figure, this is not a narrative that I see in the past. There's nothing comparable to anything in the past. Plagues occurred in India, occurred here and there. Now we have, it's not a plague, but we have this soft plague all over the earth. And this is a leveling power, because what do we need to do tomorrow? We feel to have some active role in this. We choose to follow the rules, not to follow the rules. We do not know. We do not know what happened, what would happen if we didn't follow the rules. So we act under uncertainty. Politicians act under uncertainty through trials and errors. They do not know. This is why they can be attacked very easily. But what to do? How can they know? How can they know if they can leave us out? Opening, the cages in 1 month, in 2 months, in September, we do not know. So this not knowing is the very core of cybernetics. We know that, now I'm using cybernetics metaphorically. We know that in cybernetics, one error actively serves the purpose to be corrected through negative feedback. So we have the positive feedback of the media, amplification, causing panic, causing the hospitals to be empty, causing the hospital to be empty of doctors and filled with patients that do not need to go to hospitals, with the effect of increasing the infection. But you see, all of these step-by-step events are not predictable, can be anticipated through rules of behavior. So I don't think that is the same as climate change or 9/11. There's nothing comparable to this.
Brunella, I think Patricia also has a question. I think maybe they overlap and help us with the answer. Patricia, are you around?
Yeah.
You want to unmute? Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Brunella. I'm happy you brought up this kind of general theme behind what you were just speaking about, the embodiment. It's something that I've been thinking about as well, in the sense of engaging with questions of governance and planetarity, that it's been such an abstraction that there was like very little tangible to hang on to. And of course, this is maybe, at least from my perspective, one of the first sort of somatic experiences of feeling that planetary bond in this sense, right? That in this kind of incredible vulnerability and the sort of relocation of freedom that happens, you know, when you come from this sort of liberal Western democracies where the design or when the structures are designed, the location of freedom is always on the individual node. And of course, now that's shifted to the vectors between people. And that strikes me as something quite powerful to bring into the narration question that Jan was addressing. And then the other point that is maybe a bridge between the both of you is I think it is really important that you raise the doubt about framing this in a war framework. And I think you're absolutely right. I think where the difficulty is, at least from my layperson perspective, is that in fact, institutionally, pragmatically, it strikes me just getting to know all this vocabulary that is, you know, entering into our common sense every day, that it strikes me that so many of the instruments of government to deal with this kind of acute crisis are only conceivable within a war frame, you know? So even if they're not used for, even if we're not actually in a war right now, the nomenclature of all of these tools that governments have at their disposal in various degrees, you know, those vary by constitution. But that struck me as really troubling and actually a kind of important artifact of this kind of 20th century or even prior, a Westphalian sort of model, an artifact of that sort of thinking.
Patricia, I only use those not just as like this, the sort of significance of the event. I agree with you about the metaphor and the poverty of thought that causes the media, government, and even us to kind of like.
Well, I don't know if it's so much the poverty of thought. It's actually like it reflects on the archaic nature of the governmental instruments that are at our disposal that were just, like I said, they were not conceivable in a climate crisis, or they were not conceivable in this thing. And therefore they always take on the nomenclature of this, even when applied to other situations. So I think that there's a kind of interesting correlation of narration, institutionality, and tools of governance that are there mixed with this sort of embodied thing. So it was more of a quasi question commentary to sort of bridge the two first interventions that we've had tonight.
Well, if I can answer, yes, absolutely, you're right. The freedom shifts from an individual freedom to systemic freedom. That is, our freedom depends on the freedom of the other. Kind of Adam Smith model, but a model that is a more, let's say, less individualistic than mutual adjustment. And this is what we do every day, mutually adjusting to the other's presence, etc. I wanted also to add, yes, governance, but governance itself changes meaning if emergency changes its meaning. Okay? Something is the emergency that exists in the climate change. How do we know about the climate change? Because of science, because it doesn't hit us immediately. Yes, we have a strange heat, we have too much water in the rivers, we have strange winds in Rome, but it's not a catastrophe. It doesn't touch us. Now we are really touched, and everyone is. There's no difference. You know, the governors, the ones that governing us, they are on the same boat. This is an Italian metaphor. This is why the metaphor of the war, of course, because it's a mass media metaphor. Battle is what we struggle with every day, and there's a struggle because we don't want to die. The risk of dying is really high. It's not high in the sense of a plague, but high in the sense of a horizontal quantity or duration. How much, how long will it last? This is the fear. This is the not knowing. part that is acting through trials and errors. This is my point. For instance, ventilators, the old elite says this is a scandal that old people should die because we don't have enough ventilators. But doctors have known forever, since they started becoming doctors, that they have to choose. Who would you choose between a young man, a young person, and an old person? And the young person, okay, this is judging under uncertainty and cybernetically, because doctors have to make a choice now. So it's not a matter of being unjust to leave, to let the person die, because it's a necessity. The alternative would be to have all ventilators for everyone, but how can we produce them? Of course, we are producing more and more, but it was unpredictable that we needed all of these ventilators. So we have in this thinking and acting and under uncertainty also makes us more limited, as I said, in time, space, and also in the range of solutions. For instance, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, all of these great corporations are not just the representatives of the capital, but they are they are our creators. We are their creatures. We are communicating now through them. And so it's not a matter of reducing their power, but it's a matter of making their availability absolutely global. The new technologies should become available as electricity or the telephone. So we even need to reach some compromise in the representation that we have of this particular financial investment, saying the capital is, according to me, the old elite language, the language of the old elite. It is the capital, one cause, one narrative, but the capital, exactly because it is a capital, it is distributed. It is not monolithic. It changes faces when it's convenient. So I think that one idea is that we can envisage, or we must envisage, as I think Davor called it a perma-crisis. Perma-crisis changes our minds and attitudes. Something is the crisis must be solved, the war must be won. Something else is we must cope with the perma-crisis, in which anything can be useful to cope with and keep going on. And we do not know how. This is the point. We do not know how. What we can know, and what we know is what we can make tomorrow, or what we can do tomorrow. Another example, surveillance. Of course, surveillance will increase, but at the same time, surveillance is inevitably a means of protection. Another compromise. It's useless and belonging to the old elite language to say, here the victory of the panopticon, here's the surveillance. Surveillance is already here, is already there. We are probably checked, controlled through Zoom. So another compromise is what to do with this surveillance. We can have we can get protection. We can get protection from the same tool that limits our freedom. Now, one last consideration, and then I'm done. Is the left ready to work in this condition of uncertainty and lack of references? This is my problem.
But
yeah, I guess
correct. Huh?
Go ahead.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, so you mentioned this kind of purely reactive, one step ahead, one day at a time, kind of ethical and political stance. But wasn't it exactly the feature of our world order before that, we decided like, we're not going to prepare for epidemics. We're just going to, like, the moment it starts, we're just going to deal with it one day at a time. I think, like, why don't you think we can actually try and design a system which would be more resilient here and try slowly building it? Because I mean, it doesn't really seem that this reactive approach will work in any short or longer medium term.
I don't understand your point. Of course, I don't think that we are passively reacting. We are not passively reacting. We are retroacting. This is cybernetics. The reaction, the passive reaction, is a feeling to be the effect of a cause, which is exactly what I think doesn't work anymore. What works is retroacting on the immediate cause, exactly as all institutions today are bound to do, because it's the interest of everyone that we are not, we do not stay inside of the condition, inside of this situation. So I would replace reaction with retroaction, and of course we must imagine to build a way out of it. But the way out, I doubt, is not anything that avoids or overcomes the problem definitely. We have to consider any solution, because this is what we want, solutions, but solutions that will open other problems. This is exactly what we do. If we stay at home, we do not work, we have an economic crisis. If we go out, the economic crisis is reduced, but we risk to have the virus come back. There's no complete solution. This is my point. So this is the meaning of retroaction. Let's retroact and invent something that is immediately feasible. Immediately feasible. The triage is not a good example, because there's no way that we can have an alternative to the triage. I think you call it the triage when you have to choose.
Yeah.
And we don't have any alternative. So useless to criticize the triage. I don't know if this clarifies.
Yes, let's bring in, I think Patricia has a question also. Patricia, can you wait for Davor to do some talking and then, or you want to go ahead now?
Yeah, sure, I can wait.
Okay, Davor, it's with you. Oh, I don't know how you would like to connect your talk to what Brunella was bringing up, and how it was kind of like a question by both Valentin and also some stuff that Patricia put on the table. But go ahead, Davor, you have the floor. Maybe Davor is frozen, actually. Okay, Patricia, maybe you want to, oh.
Sure, I can just ask a question, because it strikes me that, like, the word that seems to be missing from this discussion so far is risk. And I'm just wondering if, because it seems to me like if you're talking about, is the left up to the challenge of dealing with these uncertainties and so on and so forth. And there's actually a really nice article from Wendy Chun that talks about how the sort of uncertainty around climate change was like instrumentalized by the right, but that's the other thing. The general question I have is like, what would be the sort of, basically, it seems to me that the left is going to have to come up with a very solid strategy for risk, like how to narrate risk, how to pragmatically cope with it, because that's essentially what this kind of coping with this uncertainty that you're addressing. And I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that are, oh, Jan's raising his hand. So I'm going to take over Mo's moderating role and be quiet. Oh, Mo, can you unmute Jan, because he was going to just pipe in about something.
Yeah, totally. Jan, you should unmute yourself. You can't?
Oh, all right, nice. I didn't know that. Thanks a lot. No, I think thanks a lot, Patricia. I think that this reflects actually to what Valentin was saying, because one answer to this would be planning, of course, you know, because I have to strongly disagree. It is not a necessity that all people die, because we can plan in a certain way that these ventilators are enough, even in a situation of crisis. There is a difference, you know, and the concept of cybernetics, I just wanted to point out briefly, this is not a new concept also, you know, not at all. It's like an established concept that is the base layer concept of digital capitalism. This has to be pointed out clearly. So this is kind of it kind of struck me as if this was painted as if a new way to approach things, but this is already established, and it is like deep within the layer of digital capitalism. And so I would say, in order to cope with risk, to plan ahead and to have a foundation that is resilient in exactly the way that you were talking about, Patricia, in the way that that freedom is not primarily thought of as individual freedom, but as a freedom within and as community. And if we start to reflect on our institutions, on our daily life, on everything from this perspective, we will come to very different conclusions on many levels. And then we will start to build institutions in a way that has this kind of thinking on the very bottom of things. And then we will like kind of organically build institutions that are much more resilient, as I was trying to point out towards the universal basic services. If you try to look at things from this kind of perspective, it comes naturally that it totally makes sense that every human being on the whole world should have security when it comes to basic needs, and that this is necessary for all of us. Also in terms of risk, especially in terms of risk, I think.
Can I answer?
I think we should go to Davor because this conversation can kind of go back and forth. Valentin, would you like to introduce Davor?
Yeah, I think what Jan was talking about is one of the major topics of research of Davor, which is why I really want him to continue with thought. And Davor is looking at how plague changed society before, and what can this one bring.
Davor, do you want you some slides, or you want to go without slide? I really hope the second one is your choice.
You don't want me to show slides?
or show them, you know what I mean, or show them in a dynamic way, because we don't want people to be exhausted. That's all.
Okay. So I have prepared slides, but not so many. Okay, so as we said, not so many slides today. We don't have much slides.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I will just follow up on what I started the last time, right? So I didn't have time to zoom into the question. What can we learn from earlier plagues and earlier catastrophes? And today I want to go a little bit closer, zoom in a little bit closer. But again, I will not have an answer. Many of the things that I will say are kind of following up also on what was talked already about, so to speak. Can we? I just thought you will see. Everybody will know immediately what it is about. So with the PowerPoint presentation, I will show you some slides because I needed to explain things, but I will come back to you, like from time to time. So let's see if that works. Do you see the slides? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So is the COVID-19 crisis the end of capitalist realism, right? As we just talked when Brunella talked about the old elite, and when Jan talked about the new narrative that may or may not appear soon. So I have very good news for you today. I think I would say that the earth is kind of saved. So I think the future of humanity is saved. I think capitalism is dead. The only problem is I know that this is going to happen, but I cannot explain you today why this is going to happen. But I will just show you some general directions. Okay, so I just wanted to update the situation again, but I don't need to go too deep into that because I just wanted to add some new developments, but everybody knows about this. So we said the only chance is either finding a vaccine or developing the herd immunity, and this will take like at least 5 years for Germany if you do this, if there is no vaccine. But what we did now, so there's this new development, which you can call, or I mean, I think it's called even smart lockdowns. That is, a smart lockdown means you have masks, isolation, and tracking, and then these immunity licenses, and then you have a relatively normal life, right? So you can, some people can go out, some stores can open again, some companies can start working again in some way. So you have like an exit into a decelerated and fragmented business as usual. Okay, so we go back, but not fully. So this is what we are trying to do now, basically. But still, the duration is still 1 to 5 years at least of this strange state. And so the question is, do we want to go back to capitalist realism? Do we want to go back to this business as usual? Because that's what will happen, right? I mean, if we solve the problem tomorrow we are back in capitalist realism. And another question is, and this is more important, can we go back? Is there a choice, not only for us, but also for the capitalists, for the old elite? Can we go back again? Or is it really a catastrophe, as we said earlier? Okay, so from the so what I want to do is now I want to look again from a macro historical perspective. If coronavirus can become such a catalyzer, such an irreversible catalyzer, so to speak. Doesn't matter if you want it or not, doesn't matter what narrative you have or not, does it functionally push us into this new state? This is my question. Sorry.
And when you say catalyzer rather than a trigger or a cause, you mean that this future was inevitable anyway? And what's one of them?
Yes, exactly. Like the last time. Wait a second. Where's my? How do I get back from this? Like this? Am I back again? Yes, I'm back again. So yeah, so catalyzer means there are, as I said last week, like with the plague, I'll get back to that in a second. There are already tendencies and potentialities for something different, but we are still, so to say, blocked by old institutions and so on. That's exactly what I want to explain now. So if you don't mind, I'll just continue, and I'll explain now quickly the term path dependency. I'm not sure. Are you familiar with the term path dependency?
I think most people here are familiar with the term, but maybe you just want to like describe it for our audience at home.
All right. Okay. So just quickly. So path dependency, the basic principle means systems are constituted by selecting a set of relations, like functional relations, and these relations are being reproduced over time. That means the system is always in a dynamical state. Everybody knows this, like because it's it's autopoietically basically reproducing itself. Yes, and in order to find, but it must find this structure first, so to speak. And there's this so-called sort of formation. Okay, let me. So the system has to form, and once it forms, then it's very difficult to go to another path, so to speak, to another state. So there are usually 3 phases in system formation. Not usually, but these are the 3 formal phases of system formation. This is the first phase is the pre-formation phase, where you have a lot of different options, and from this, the options are, so to speak, narrowed down. After a critical phase, the system starts to select more and more of its components, so to speak, or let's say it selects more and more options and brushes off other options, that it can of states in itself. So this is the formation state, and then in the end we have the lock-in. The system is completely stable and keeps on rolling, so to speak. But then it cannot divert anymore from its original path, right? So these are the 3 phases. So the problem is now that when you're in the lock-in phase, then the system can become inflexible. For example, you have a new threat or a shock or a catastrophe like we have today, right? You have a system which is inflexible. It cannot change its path anymore, so to speak. It can also be inefficient, or it can be detrimental from its own consequences, or so to speak, suffer from its own consequences. So the problem is when the system is in the lock-in phase, it cannot move away anymore, so to speak, from this state. Yeah? And it also doesn't see basically sometimes the danger coming. Right? Anyway, so the point is now this: there are classical examples of the of path formation. Is the QWERTY keyboard. I guess everybody knows, right, the problem. So the reason why we have a QWERTY keyboard today, which is totally inefficient for typing, is because the arms would always get stuck in each other in the beginning when we invented the typing machine, the typewriter. So another example for path formation is, for example, the French Revolution. So on the right side, you can see all the factions that were in the beginning, the option how France could look like in the future. Yeah. So there are like 50 factions or something like this, and all of them had a different idea how the system should be in the end. Okay, it's just to illustrate this. And of course, today we are also in a path dependence. So the currently problematic path dependencies are, for example, the use of fossil fuels. We are stuck technically and also militarily, mainly in fossil fuels. We simply cannot go away from them. So you can't. So this is a path dependency which causes global warming. Then we have the idea of capitalist growth, of course. Exploitation, inequality, the euphemism for exploitation, and then environmental destruction are the consequences of this path dependence. And then we have another outdated system, which is the parliamentary system. For example, the ratio of representatives in the USA was originally set to be 1 representative for 30,000 citizens, right? And today you have 1 representative for 700,000 citizens. And this doesn't work. The system doesn't make any sense anymore. So this one person cannot represent the interests of 700,000. And then we get the lobbyism and whatever, corruption and so on. So it's much easier. So in other words, the system became perverted, and because we didn't update it. And even if we would update it, the question is with this, if it still would work with all the citizens that are alive today compared to 1789. Okay, so in other words, capitalist realism is nothing else than a lock-in. Yeah. So we have is exactly the lock-in phase of a system, and we cannot get out of this. So the famous saying, it is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. So this is exactly what a lock-in means. We cannot get out of the system. So in other words, we have an outdated mode of production and distribution, outdated institutions, outdated subjectivity, and cognition virtues, and even an outdated temporality. So, okay, so this would be, okay, I'll stop here for a moment. Is this clear so far, or, yeah? Okay, so this, yeah.
Davor, I would like to sort of like say, maybe this is what you're going to say, but I think with the pandemic, we're back to this, like in a level, we're back to that stage 1 of the 3 in a way. If not, maybe like a fast track to the stage 2 where like patterns are emerging. But like so it's a great time for capitalism to reinvent itself. It's an amazing moment for capitalism to reinvent itself. And given the state of the left, capitalism will reinvent itself, unfortunately, because the conditions are absolutely right for capitalism to reinvent itself. Now, I will get into that, but I'll let you sort of like continue on, and then we can come back to that. Go ahead.
Okay, you will see. That's exactly what I want to discuss. There is now this thing. So, okay. So now we said last time we talked about the plagues, and let's look at this again. So the plague is catalyzer of a system transition. So we have a similar situation today as we had in the 13th century. So in the feudal, commercial, and agrarian revolution, or between 900, which started around 900 AC, this resulted in a huge surge in productivity and population. And But in the 13th century already, it became evident that the institutions which were originally successful became inefficient to, to manage a population which is 3 times as high, and all the energy that was produced in the meantime. So in other words, there was no escape from the lock-in in this at these times. So this was also a lock-in phase, basically. So we were stuck in feudalism. And what then happened was that the escape from the feudal path dependence happened then by Black Death, because the plague broke this. So the plague broke this path dependence. So by eradicate, but here very harshly, simply by eradicating its substance, it means it killed simply 30% of all humans, right? And by that it paved the way to modernity. So you see this here. We have this huge, a subtraction of humans, basically. So, and Corona is not as bad as the Black Death, obviously. But the question is, from macro historical perspective, are we still in an analog situation, in a lock-in situation? So my question is this: we can say, so this is basically history, all the phenomena of history of modernity, from 900 till today. So you can say Black Death was, so to speak, catalyzing all the tendencies which were already present in feudalism, but then it turned, so to speak, the path into modernity. And the question is, if Corona is the same to capitalist realism. So do we get out of capitalist realism through Corona into the technological civilization? So could this be the bifurcation point, or can we shake off the remainders of modernity through this? So this was the basic idea. And let me just see quickly. Do we have questions here? Anything?
Yes, I want to say we should maybe avoid like too much of big generalized statements, especially given the data that's coming to us now. We've been in this now for like a month, right? Yeah. Already data's coming from, you know what I mean, like in a regular economic downturn. From what I understand, all sectors of economies suffer, including banking and business and retail and everything, right? But when we look at what's happening in the last 4 weeks, is that a new type of capitalism actually is repressing. We can call it like essential capitalism. It's kind of like coming to replace real capitalist realism. What is essential realism? The essential realism is right now is that those businesses that were allowed to operate or they're considered essential are booming. I was reading yesterday how production at Campbell's Soup or like traditional sort of like packaged food American companies have gone off the roof. They're hiring extra people, paying overtime, right? Let's not forget like the production of masks, the production of like all sorts of like crowd control stuff that's needed for future stuff, like all sorts of economic activities actually going up. So we have this sort of like economy in which maybe a majority part of the capitalism is kind of like downward, but part of it is actually shooting off the roof. And this can be leveraged through policy, through decision making, through the help of the media, you know what I mean, to try to by normalizing certain business transactions, by bringing them into like what's essential, or by expanding a little bit, you can create a dynamic in which you can actually let capitalism morph. Now, I have more to say about this, but I don't want to like take over. So I just thought I should like put that on the table for you to continue. You're continuing.
Yeah, I see. See, the point is what I'm arguing, not what I'm arguing. I just want to present an idea, basically, which states that if capitalism wants to survive, even in the way how you could just described it, then it will produce technologies that will make it impossible in the long run. So this is the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and they will. I mean, right now, underneath this sort of like focus on daily death numbers, there's a huge discussion going on, right? There's a huge discussion going on about like basically the use of technology to test people for antibodies, for to test people for virus and for the antibodies and use them basically to decide who's gonna go to work and who's not gonna go to work. I mean, I'm reading these ideas being discussed by sort of like respected journalists, respected papers, right? Of course, that means like we need millions of antibody testing machines. These will need workers to be produced, you know, and placed everywhere, you know, right next to the soap thing that you have to push and raise your hand, you will test your antibody to see if you, and you know, this is not just preparation for coronavirus, it's preparation for this type of pandemics that now once you experience this, like system has to sort of like protect itself against similar future sort of like stuff, right? So yeah, so I mean, we have to think of all these things if we are going to theorize, because you can't just theorize from some kind of like idea or knowledge from the past, or sort of like what those sort of like people who have been like rightly criticized by a lot of people like Agamben and those did from their 20th century sort of like rotten position, right?
Yes. Yeah. I hope nobody misunderstands what I'm doing. I'm not saying we are looking at the plague and then transferring it to the present or something like this. This is not what I'm doing. I'm just saying, I'm just looking at conceptual analogies or schematic similarities, so to speak, because there is a similarity, as I said, since industrialization began, and since 150 years ago or something like this, with, for example, with chemical, how to say, sorry, how to say, agrarian culture, you know, so the productivity of the West rose like 1,000-fold or something like this. And trade and economy and growth and so on. And at the same time, we have a population from which grew from 1 billion to 8 billion today, right? And it's going to keep on growing. So in other words, we have somewhat a similar situation to the Middle Ages with the plague, in that sense that we are still in institutions which are 250 years old, right? But we have new technologies, for example, internet, the computer, this unbelievable productivity, and 8 billion people all of a sudden. So what I'm saying is that the idea is that Corona could be just exactly the same. So how should I say? It could present us the same necessities for a restructuring of the system, like the plague did. This is my point. Okay, so I'm not saying it's the same. I'm not saying you can transfer it or something like that. Anyway, so let me just quickly finish the presentation, and then you will see. So, so the point is that if you look at history, and okay, so you can. I skipped a little bit. So okay, so if you look at history, you can see that there are distinct shifts in civilization, and you can see that these shifts always appear when there is a new medium, a new economic medium appearing, right? So you have, for example, the early cultures like Egypt and Mesopotamia, they invent writing and early science and so on, and so they come up with metric currency. Then in the axial age, where philosophy appears, where the alphabet appears and so on, you have the coin appearing. And then in the beginning of modernity, which is again a distinct phase in history, you have capital appearing, right? And so the question is, what is appearing now with the technological civilization, which is also defined, which can be defined as a distinct new stage. So what kind of new medium will we have after capital? And I'm claiming that Corona could be the beginning of the development of this new economical medium, building on capital but going beyond capital. So this is the idea. So what will we overcome? The brute globalization, as I call it, you know, I don't know, maybe there's a better name, but this is simply, you know, it's brute globalization that we had in the 20th century and the 21st century, which is still based on the Westphalian system, right? This is so that's what I mean with brute. You still have the nation state, basically, which is just occupying Earth. So you have different nation states which are still which are kind of occupying the planet. And so you have capital from modernity, then you have contractuality, the central banks, the old system, then also the modern subject and so on. And so I'm claiming but I cannot show this today because I would need to have more time. So I'm claiming that in order to save the old system, the elite, which we have right now, so the current elite, the current capitalists, the current politicians and technocrats and so on, we will try to save the old system, but we will have to do that by the newest technologies that exist. And these newest technologies will necessarily, like historical necessity, if I may say this, will provide the foundation of the new system. So we are witnessing right now the onset of a new stage in civilization, and this is smart planetarization. And this is not brute globalization as it was before, but smart planetarization, or others could call it the technological civilization. Yeah, I'll just skip what exactly that means, maybe. To be continued another time. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, I had the feeling that I just stopped when it became interesting, but yeah, I know.
I think I saw a bunch of questions. Anil had a question about the new monetary system for this new order, which even you agree might be and end up being based on the current capitalist system, as the current capitalist system is based on the previous like early bourgeois revolution, prior to that on feudalism and on Westphalian nation state and all that, right? So I don't know if you want to start with Anil with a question of monetary, and if you have more to say about it.
Yes, no, I'm just, I guess I don't share some of your optimism. I mean, here's the problem for me in your analysis. I think you have a very systems-based kind of macro-historical, almost kind of like a grand narrative approach here in terms of technological civilizations. This is precisely the kind of thing that is breaking down right now. Ecology doesn't deal in grand narratives. And this is what, for me, this is the challenge, is to have a political economic system that could think through ecology. And it really doesn't deal in grand narratives at all. We struggle to narrativize it. No, that's actually a big problem for us politically.
Maybe that's your perspective.
So I'm wondering, so this seems at odds with your analysis. Yes, COVID could be the beginning of some new political economic system, but this is, what is, we can't just be engaging in wishful thinking. I think that we need to question the purpose of narrative, as Jan was doing earlier as well. In all this, and I would be very careful with some of these narratives.
Anil, what you said remind me of Mackenzie Wark's latest book title, right? Like, this is not capitalism, but capital is dead. This is something worse, right? So like,
yes, like narrative is dead. Ecology couldn't give a shit. It's a kind of, it's not a kind of mourning. It's how do we adjust our narratives, or how do we do narrative differently politically speaking. I think Brunella spoke a little bit about this as well. It's part of the ecological question for me, which is, so my analysis would be very, I think complex systems, and Davor's utilizing a lot of concepts from complexity science. Again, narrative gets lost there a lot of the time. There is path dependence, and there is a memory in a complex system, as Davor was mentioning, but it doesn't equate to some kind of consistency that we can give a kind of narrative voice to in kind of concrete stages and things like this. It becomes very difficult to apply that in complexity science.
At some point I would like to say something. Can I say
something? You will get a chance, not to worry. I just want to get Mattin to kind of like reflect.
No, I want to reply to this immediately, because there was a lot of mistakes. I'm sorry. No, the point is, I didn't finish actually. So what I didn't do is I didn't tell a narrative for some magic scheme, and now we have to know that some things will happen or something like this. I said I wasn't explicit enough. So number one is, it is kind of a battle between the metaphysics. If you think that if history has some order in it, or if it's just contingent, you cannot prove it, and I cannot prove it, right? I mean, neither the one position can be proven nor the other position can be proven. So the point is, we are looking for patterns and principles, and that's what I did, so to speak. And for that, you can use systems theory and theory, of complex dynamic systems and so on. I don't do that personally. I just use it now as metaphors to explain quickly what is meant. I'm more like interested in other things. But the reason why I said that we can expect, why I'm sure that there will be consequences, so to speak, of Corona, is not, because of the narrative itself, because I believe in this progress of humanity or something like this, the stages and stuff. This was not the reason, but the reason was simply this. Look at the consequences now. So the West will start to live normal again soon. Like let's say 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 months, let's say 6 months or something like this. You will have an immunity license. People will go out on the street. There will be a vaccine and so on. But what happens, for example, to the developing countries, to Africa, North Africa, India, and so on? They will.
What do you mean by developing, Davor?
That was okay. Sorry, the third world country. I don't know if you use
what are they developing into?
No, I'm not. No, I just use the term that people use in German saying fiction
around developing and not get into definite terminology definition. We all know what Davor means by developing countries. Maybe.
But this gets back to the original point. It's about narrative. That's another narrative.
Oh no! You're misunderstanding me. No. Sorry. You must misunderstand. I just meant to name these countries. Okay, I just meant to name India, parts of India. I just meant to name the poor third world countries. Okay.
There is a political geography to COVID, right? We just published Mina's piece on it, right? Basically, like, you know what I mean? Like Mina's point was that America is positively responsible for its allies, but is negatively responsible for the people it puts under sanctions. So under current condition, America is responsible for the Iranian response to COVID. So it has to lift sanctions because of that type of responsibility, right? But if you even look at the map, could be like the hot spots could just move to the global south. Let's put it that way, to the global south, where the ability of the government systems and the medical system to deal with it could be much more more limited than even the United States, and you might end up with like loss of large numbers of people, right? So I think that's what Davor was getting into, right?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
Go ahead.
That's exactly what I wanted to say. So think of, for example, Cairo has like 22 million people, in the city, and and they were famous already before the crisis. The people would die of lung cancer because the air is so horrible. It's so. So what I'm saying is, it's pretty likely that all these third world countries, I don't know what the name is today for these countries, emerging countries maybe, or something like this. I don't know, whatever they call them, that they will really collapse. There's no medicine. There is nothing. So this will. So in other words, what I'm saying is, the world system, center, periphery, the bringing in the resources and selling them products, all this may collapse simply. So the center periphery thing will collapse, and even though the West will kind of recuperate and become healthy again and start the machines again, so to speak, still the old system will not work. So in other words,
but Davor, what makes you think that this is not itself a golden opportunity for global capitalism to reinvent itself? If these systems are collapsing, as you're speculating, this is a golden era of a new form of colonialism and imperialism, this time aided by Google and Facebook and all kinds of technological ability that the West has that allows it to have a different type of world management system put in place. The very same people who are very hard to lobby from the left and already are thinking how to exploit the situation.
Exactly. For this time, it will be with predictive technologies, and this is the difference. So this time, you will have to predict future outcomes, outbreaks. Hotspots. You will have to predict how they spread on Earth. Where the hotspot is and so on, because you don't want because you need to control the flow of resources and goods and services very fine-grained, and where you can produce and where not. So this is the next step, so to speak. So in other words, as I said, capitalism, to save itself, to reinvent itself, will introduce these predictive technologies. And that means surveillance of everything, basically. Yeah. I mean, I'm just throwing it out. So surveillance in the sense of you need a very fine-grained surveillance in the sense of data gathering of whatever is happening everywhere on the planet. Yeah. And so the point is, I'm saying that exactly this fine-grained surveillance of every event on the planet could be then, so to speak, the basis for, how should I say, in that moment when the algorithms are taking over the control of the surveillance and of the resource flow, then you don't have humans behind this anymore. And then you can automatize the resource flow. Yeah, this is the idea. Okay, so the idea is that in a moment when capitalism tries to save itself, it will instantiate algorithmic control, and this algorithmic control will be the foundation of an automated distribution of goods and services. That's what I say. This is the potential. This is what I wanted to go at, and this is the potential that we have already today. You know, just like in the feudal system, there were already potentials, so to speak, but they didn't come out, you know, before the plague came, and so coronavirus could be exactly, you know, saving capitalism from coronavirus could be initiating this new algorithmic distributed system. So this is basically all I wanted to say.
Good place to end. Mattin, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation and this great discussion. So we'll try to express some thoughts connecting the current situation to some ideas that I've been working in the last years, which I'm struggling a lot, but I actually came up with a title, which is Between Fragmentation and Collective Self-Determination. So we know that the consequences of what's happening are going to be massive. They are being massive, many deaths, and at the economical level. Today I was just reading that 58% of the US population will not be able to pay the rent. The GDP of France is going to go down 6%. Germany probably in the next month more than 10%. So we can see that the economy is going to go down and there will be many social struggles. So recently I've been editing a book with a friend, Anthony Alves, on the notion of real subsumption. It's a Marxist concept, which has been crucial for some debates on the left. So I guess you might already know about it. So the way it goes is Marx made this differentiation between formal subsumption and real subsumption. Formal subsumption is when capitalism takes hold of established forms of production, let's say farming, and then it takes advantage of them in the process of producing value. The difference with real subsumption will be that the whole production process will be made in order to produce value. So it incorporates the capitalist logic already in its foundation. This concept has been crucial as a way to try to understand what is the level of integration of living labor, which, in other words, you know, what will be the room to maneuver for these social struggles. In the 70s, there were discussions in France with a group called Negation, in which was claiming that the working class, the proletariat, is already totally integrated within the capitalist production. We are in the peak of this real subsumption, which means that no possible demands could have an effect. No program was possible to produce. So it's like what they call the end of programmatism. So then it will be only a matter of the struggles to emerge immanently and produce their own communist measures, which this is like the foundation of communization theory, more or less. But this is a more historical understanding of the concept of real subsumption. So there is another one that is a more logical, that it understands that capitalism in itself had always elements of this real subsumption. So it was always immanent to capitalism. So what does this means? That that in both they make our room to maneuver very, very limiting. So there are forms of totalization that have been contested. And I would like to contest it pointing another differentiation, which is one that Ray Brazier makes. I hope I can bring it back to the whole COVID-19 and it will make sense. So Ray makes a distinction in a text between concrete in thought and concrete in act. Concrete in act will be the practices of what we do that are not socially validated. They are unconscious, not in the psychoanalytical term, but in the sense that we don't know, we don't understand them, what we're doing. Then there is the concrete in thought, which will be the kind of consciousness, the socially validation in which capitalism takes hold. So what I will argue is that while in the first term, in concrete in thought, the totality of the capitalist integration is not yet complete, because there is still a level of valorization. There is a moment in the form of concrete in thought, in this socially validation, that it gets hold and it produces a form of reification, in the sense that social dynamics produce the semblance of autonomy. So it conditions our own thinking, and the conditions our own thinking about our practice. For me, the important thing is the way that it conditions our own self-conception. And maybe here we're getting closer with some of the debates that we have been talking about. So, I mean, this understanding of autonomy, which was crucial for the enlightenment and for the development of the liberal subject, is underneath, has this social activities that we do. This is dangerous in these days, because it understands that we can access first nature from the position of a second nature, which for some people like Postone is like the seeds for anti-Semitism, in which, or other forms, like he sees also like in forms of anarchist or insurrectionist tendencies, in which they fetishize use value, as if we could, from the perspective of today, in which capitalist mediations runs through all our activity and our roles and conception, we will be able to access some concrete ability to do certain things. For me, this turns into a crucial moment in regards to our self-conception. And I think it kind of goes back to the whole Bernie Sanders discussion. I mean, we can see that the liberal subject is being discussed here is cracking up very badly. And you've been putting some of the examples. I think Davor, for me, the moment in which you see that one representative would have 700 people behind, 700,000. So so the distance is becoming increasingly bigger. Another element for me in which this liberal understanding of what we have is cracking up, it's in regards to the law. Is not able to deal with current social movements like the Me Too, like other forms of struggles that, thanks to the internet, are able to express themselves. So the legal system is not able to hold that kind of idea of the liberal subject, which is this form of reification of being a sovereign subject. And I think another point will be with the triage. With the triage, when one life has to be valid, when somebody chooses which life gets more, gets the possibility to live are not, is another element in which the liberal idea starts to collapse. So for me, this, and I was thinking about this collapsing previously in relationship to what I call social dissonance, which is this collapsing of the idea of the individual with the self, with the sovereign subject. So it's a form of cognitive dissonance at the structural level, which conditions our whole self-conception. And this, I think, is turning into a very mild type of approach. Talking recently with Cecile Malaspina, which in her book of Noise talks on the issue of noise from the psychological perspective. She brings the concept, the work of Sansan Reti, the concept of the mental state of noise. And the mental state of noise is, in psychological terms, as they define it, with precisely their own self-conception totally vanishes. There is no borders. There is no possibility to differentiate from the other. So I think at the moment we found ourselves getting closer to this general mental state of noise. And this is, I think, very problematic, because we don't have a kind of good ground in which to basically have our own self-conception is up for grabs. And in this confusion could come what she calls the catastrophic reaction. The catastrophic reaction is a concept that she takes from Kurt Goldstein, which was a neurologist doing analysis and treating post-traumatic patients in the First World War, in which very simple acts for them will turn absolutely, there will be a lot of work. There will be almost as if they will be bringing back certain traumas from the war. And I think the danger in today's reality, if we have our own self-conception collapsing, it could bring this form of catastrophic reaction. And I think we can see some elements of this in the terms that many people have to conspiracy theories, for example. And I don't have much to offer, unless, only that the way that we will need to conceive ourselves will not be, already this idea of the individual as self-sufficient is being drastically and radically undermined by the current conditions. But the question is, what kind of form of understanding we will have, in which takes into account fragmentation, vulnerability, fragility, and alienation. And I don't see any, I don't see so far yet these forms of collective organization that take that as their basis. They take it, they are there, through and through, but I don't know if they're being conceptualized, expressed, or being developed. So maybe some of you know, but what I see is, like, I certainly see the problems of Bernie Sanders as outdated forms of politics that still bases on the idea of democracies, and we have seen how that democracy is being constantly undermined. I think, yeah, and it was quite positive about Podemos. I am not so positive. They really had to, in order to maintain power, they had to turn their policies, they have to turn their policies quite weak. They are in a government, which, for example, just before the crisis, the exterior minister was making the borders tougher in Spain. So inevitably, they will run into contradictions that, and they run into contradictions that undermines their own purpose. And I don't see, and I don't want to be like a kind of Puritan politics type of person, but it's just like that if you run your political foundations in already an outdated self-conception, I don't know what I think it will counter limitations very, very rapidly, as we have seen it before previously in the Syriza is the perfect example. So yeah,
Patricia, how you doing?
My contribution.
Patricia, yeah. Would you like to take the floor?
Not really. I mean, I told you in the email, I don't really, I'm a slow learner, so I'm kind of very wary to have some kind of, I don't really have like a kind of coherent response to this condition. I am interested in how it's going to,
Maybe about things you heard tonight.
Well, definitely like have been taking loads of notes, and I mean, I'm totally on board with what Mattin was saying, in the sense of like, this dissolving or the collapsing of the liberal subject. And then it's also interesting to think about, if you put it in line with Davor's, I think, quite compelling account of path dependencies, because I think that also kind of ties into what someone else said earlier. I can't recall who, but about if you establish certain norms, then they can't really be undone at a certain point, right? But yeah, I mean, I don't have some kind of overarching take on the situation. I'm kind of a bit opposed to that personally. I think we've seen a lot of very quick. I think like if we go too quickly conceptually, then we're already defaulting to some kind of like pre-made theories, and it's maybe more helpful to be like trying to provoke questions at this point. So yeah, sorry to disappoint, but I don't really have some kind of great take on the situation just yet. Just trying to wait for it to work on. But I think that, like the tricky thing is like, we're talking about all this kind of highfalutin conceptual ideals about like the collapse of the liberal subject, et cetera, et cetera. And then the question is, so, what sorts of subjectivities emerge out of that? How do they get institutional? I mean, these are all like huge questions, and I feel quite, I feel very inept to address that linkage between the concept creation and the structural articulation of those concepts. Right. And if I'm honest, I don't really, even theorists I adore and love and who nourish me, I don't feel are so gifted in that. And I would be really curious to have policy people, like people who are basically taking these ideas, right? That was even said at the very beginning with Jan, right? Taking these ideas, but then figuring out the ways of like the implementation. And to me, that also means that we need a kind of proper or adequate theory of power in this context. Clearly, we see the kind of through, and not to just keep harping on poor Gambin or something, but like basically the theories of power that we had that maybe were suited to a certain context. I mean, you could debate that, but let's say they were suited to a specific context, a historical material condition, don't apply to even be generous, they don't apply one-to-one. And the question is, do they apply at all? And I'm not really sure, and perhaps somebody in the group here has some kind of, resources or something about, contemporary theories of power that are, let's say, that are kind of updating themselves, let's just say. Because I keep realizing that is a kind of missing link in my own thinking as well, in terms of like how to make these ideas operational. So maybe it's just to kind of put it out there to the floor or to whoever's watching to see if what your takes are on that, because we've got a lot of very clever people here. So
we're gonna like go to Jason, but before I wanted to say that it's easy to sort of like think that with this big shock to the world, like most levels of human creativity will get involved to try to play their part into being a remedy or like fixing some wrongs that sort of like allowed something like this to be unnoticed, right? And this goes all the way from, of course, like medical science, but it extends into like our territory, because you know, like from architecture to city planning to interior design to fashion, they all have to go through absorbing this shock and responding to it by providing us with better tools and better ways of sort of like accepting that this risk always was there. So, and build it into what we call sort of like the 21st century civilization. So that's kind of like interesting. And then think of like, okay, where would be the place of art in that? Because I brought it from sort of like all the way from sort of like science and technology to architecture and fashion, but what about art? So that's sort of like a place that like art world sees itself, like sort of like it's also in the art world. This is also as significant because it's almost like it's totally like everybody, even like Jerry Saltz is talking about like the collapse of the art world. Like he's saying like the old art world is just gone, dead. After this, it's just goodbye. So what kind of opportunities that provide for whom to define sort of like what is going to be art and what is going to be, how art going to respond to this, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean any kind of like direct or didactic connection, right? Like or function, because art can't act like architecture and fashion does. But in a way, I'm kind of like thinking along those lines. So this will be questions we'll be asking maybe in future episodes of Sheltering Places. So yeah, Jason, it would be interesting to have you on. So if you want to like take over the floor, you've been listening and waiting. And so I would like to hear what you would like to share with us.
Sure. I think kind of side dimensions to this. So there are three elements that intrigue me about sort of what arises in eras of great disquiet or catastrophe. The first is that it allows us to rethink a philosophy of vanguards. The second is that eras of unrest or of disquiet allow us to rethink philosophies of play. And the third are philosophies of violence. So just to run through them quickly, it's well that sectarian movements arise sort of precisely in these types of conditions. So cults, undergrounds, secret societies, avant-garde movements, that they're prone to sort of burst. The reason, I mean, it makes sense, obviously, that when you're facing something like a pandemic, there's this overwhelming sense of futility or the depletion of purpose. It often gets energetically countered by new paradigms of fanatical imagination, right? So nihilism by new militancy, and you can go way back to the ancient world for that. If you look at an ancient philosopher like Anaximander, for instance, who's often considered a Greek philosopher, he lived in what today would be Turkey and under the Persian Empire. He conceived this fascinating sort of concept of apeiron, the infinite, right, which is based on Babylonian creation myths, the idea that, you know, first there's this watery void or this darkness sort of that existed in this sort of formless infinity. And Anaximander takes it a step further, and he describes these sort of substance state of unity at the beginning of the world. But then he compounds it by having a very suspicious and paranoid idea that everything since then, what we call creation or reality, is a betrayal and a violation of that original state of unity. And that infinite force of the origin, apeiron, is desperately trying to wrest back, right? And so it's trying all kinds of subtle, clandestine, violent means in order to wrest us back into the state of formless unity. This fits me because this type of doomsday worldview arises precisely in a time of extreme famine and conquest that he was experiencing. So whether or not there are mirrors and parallels between sort of the rise of fanatical movements or fanatical imagination and the rise of vanguards. Also keep in mind on the more creative side of things that European avant-garde movements of the 20th century were born the First and Second World Wars. And that's not, sort of incidental or coincidental. They were facing this sort of genocidal challenge, which was the idea, as their cities were burning around them, to try and conceive radical originality and to will great aesthetic events in the face of disappearance and possibly apocalypse. Same thing with Japanese literature after the war and after the bombings there. And so that's something to keep in mind, is sort of what creative forces might arise from these types of circumstances. But maybe we should take a lesson from those creative forces that have existed in times of catastrophe, whether it's surrealism or whether it's plague storytelling in the medieval era, or even Middle Eastern avant-garde writers who nobody really reads, unfortunately, but they've been for a long time dealing with crises of war, exile, imprisonment, totalitarianism, and writing in states of catastrophe. And what they have all done sort of in synchronicity, which we're perhaps failing in Western modernity, is that they recognize the role of art, to go back to Mohammed's question, of aesthetics and of philosophy as one of increasing their untimeliness and abstraction in the moment of catastrophe. So we all keep talking about the fact that right now we see the failure of so-called public intellectuals and theorists to come out and just repeat these narcissistic cliches and all of that. And part of the reason is that there's a desperate attempt for relevance and for engagement of the phenomenon of the virus head on, where I think that our talents and our gifts lie in more visionary states of delirium, more hallucinogenic, sort of unreal approaches to questions of this nature. We have to preserve our enigmatic and our sort of cryptic side. I think that's the best angle, rather than becoming pseudoscientists or pseudo-politicians at a lot of levels. But that's just my view, seeing that. Another reason too is that we can capitalize on this moment, is that it's in times of catastrophe that you see the return of the interest in storytellers and philosophers, by the way, historically. And the reason for that is because people fundamentally misunderstand the roles of storytellers and philosophers. In a time of crisis, they think that the storyteller provides distraction, which is fundamentally wrong. The storyteller, if you know their histories, they're precisely harbingers of death. They are the ones who introduce human societies to the idea of finitude by literally speaking the words the end. And secondly, the idea that philosophers provide meaning in eras of catastrophe, which is also fundamentally wrong, because we compound perplexity and bewilderment. And one of our first destinies was to increase, not to bring truths. So at any rate, the second idea that I'm interested in is how philosophies of play are impacted by something like this pandemic. And play is an extremely important concept everybody knows, as capitalist technology increasingly tries to shift paradigms of production towards ideas of play. Everybody's playing, sort of, and even totalitarian surveillance mechanisms are trying to mimic games increasingly, as many people know. And in fact, an interesting thing that goes against a lot of the Marxist narratives, unfortunately, is that part of what's virus in the Mediterranean countries, and I've been in Spain for the past 2 months, and one of the epicenters, is that it's ironically not a consequence of tyrannical political economic structures, but a lot of leisure culture and play culture had to do with the spread of the infection. Tourism, restaurant culture, cafe culture, and soccer matches. That's one of the major places where virus was spread. So for me, then, what's intriguing is the challenge to go back to great philosophers of games. So a figure like Roger Caillois, who in 1961 wrote brilliantly a book called Man, Play, and Games, in which he delineated 4 fundamental types of games. The first is Agon, which are games of pure skill. That's like chess and archery. Second was Alea, which are games of pure chance. That's like playing the lottery or slot machines. Of course, by the way, most gambling is a combination of Agon and Alea, of skill and chance, like poker or blackjack. You have to both know sort of how to navigate strategically, but you also have to get good cards. The third sort of archetype of gameplay is mimesis. So those are games of role playing, which kids do as instinctually when they do pretend games, sort of as children. But we, in later sort of life, we do masquerades, costume parties, or video games, sort of where we create avatars and do role playing. And then the fourth category of games, according to Caillois, was ilinx, which means in ancient Greek whirlpool or And those are games that don't have any rhyme or reason or any real rules or any winner or loser. They're about sensation, pure sensation. So skydiving, roller coasters, and what at sort of the most basic childish level, spinning around until you get dizzy and fall on the ground, right? In my own work, I try to add to these four categories a fifth category, one which is games of subversion. So that's when you take pleasure in pushing things. That's like when you set up domino, watch them fall, or vandalism. So graffiti aesthetics is about subversive gameplay, and hacker culture, obviously. But also games of, and this is a sixth category, massive defeat. This is something rarely analyzed. There are certain games where the greatest pleasure is actually derived from losing or being caught. So for instance, hide and seek. The greatest pleasure is experienced by the person who's found, not by the person who's been chasing. That, or even tag for that matter. Instances, the person who catches you ultimately just experiences a sensation of relief of having to seek. So what's interesting to me is that I'm noticing in this sort of momentary this era of paranoia and this era of sort of conflict that people are trying desperately to use these categories of gameplay to explain the pandemic. So some people will side on sort of pure skill, which means they think through speculation analysis that they can reason their way into it and out of it. Then there's the sort of alea, the pure chance people who just love to sort of throw their hands up to dreams of radical contingency and just pure accident and dumb luck. And then you've got your, I mean, I can keep analysis, it can go further, mimesis, everybody wearing these pseudo masks of being scientists and of being sort of, sort of public figures and all of that. And also being in virtual worlds increasingly makes us mask ourselves. So there's a lot of mimetic play. And then illings, the games of sensation, our fetishistic checking of death tolls, our fetishistic explanation of symptomatologies of the disease, is all just illingic games, sort of these vertiginous games of the whirlpool. But what Calwa, who's an absolute genius, misses in his definition of play is that he has a purely human-centric and voluntary understanding of what it is to be in a game. You have to enter of your own free will. We're facing something radically different than he anticipated. We are in the midst of a new category, which is being caught in the inhuman, involuntary game of another. It's not our game. It's the game of the virus. And for this, we have to go back to people who actually lived in times of catastrophe, understood their vulnerability, to mention Mattin's term. Medieval Iranian poets used to call this being in the wheel being a reference to fate or world or time, and that it turns of its own volition. And no matter how much we wish to assert ourselves actively as players, we're more pawns or playthings on the checkerboard. And the final sort of philosophy wanted to make philosophies of violence need to be reimagined potentially in interesting ways. Many of you know probably Walter Benjamin categorized essential types of violence, then he takes that legacy and they divide it up into the idea of subjective violence, which is just individual murder. That's Mohammed and I get into a fight one night in a bar and he cuts my throat and it's completely identifiable who the subjects are. It's a crime of passion, heat of the moment. And we always experience subjective violence as a rupture in the continuing day, even though it's a complete fake performance on our part. Every time there's a mass shooting, we pretend it's not sort of endemic. We pretend that it's some great option in our normality, but we have to play that role. Then there's, of course, objective violence, which is what most of you have been talking about tonight, political economic structures, which is just the line itself, which goes unnoticed and imperceptible, sort of like a drone in the background, because it is the very function of reality. Then there's violence, that's the violence embedded in our language and knowledge paradigms. Mythic violence, that's an interesting one. That's when you have an ideology. So that's, again, the sort of the fascist sort of cause, for instance, is an example of that, when you're driven by some fever dream of an ideological, whether it's religious, political, nationalist. And then Benjamin speculates on a really fascinating idea, which is divine violence, which is revolutionary. That's like the riot crowd that just gets consumed by a kind of a physics of destruction and passion and solidarity, and they sort of run through it and set fire to statues and things of that nature. But all of this, again, is very human-centric. we can add to this configuration a new strata, which is that of existential violence, which is, again, to go back to existentialists who are not that popular for some reason these days, but they're the ones who reminded us of the violence intrinsic to existence itself, that creation itself is a violent phenomenon. William Burroughs says, quote, "This is a war universe." So from Heidegger's ideas of thrownness to sort of all kinds of just obvious patterns of extinction that we face, cosmic sort of forces, I think that increasingly what we see in the experiment of Western modernity is the attempt to create false utopias. Bataille called this sort of the denial of the accursed share. We don't honor the gods of radical negativity anymore. We don't sort of honor famine, plague, war, death, suffering. Instead, we create suburbanized malls and sort of, the house and the sort of with the mortgage, and think that insularity sort of allows us an antidote to the fact that the house, the school, the town, the nation, and it leaves us ill prepared for catastrophic interruptions like this, which some philosophers call the abyss. We've always been in the abyss. The abyss is not some sort of far away, distant, remote, transcendent sphere. We're in it. We're always in it. This is something, again, Blanchot beautifully documents in The Writing of the Disaster, where he says it ruins everything while leaving everything intact. And it makes me think that it's not to glorify past generations, but I'll just leave on a story more than anything, that my grandparents, their generation in Iran in the old days, they took as sort of a fact, sort of a possible certainty that they would lose children at birth. Infant mortality rates were very high. So I had an uncle, I have two uncles to this day, but I had an uncle who died when he was 3, died in his crib of intestinal disorders. They didn't have the correct medical coverage in those days or even explanations for what he was suffering from. So the child suffered for 3 years and then dies. And the child's name was Saeed. And when I was told this story when I was about 12 years old, and I found out for the first time that my grandparents had lost one of their 5 children at age 3, I was shocked by a simple fact, which is that I have an Uncle Saeed, which means that the next child they had, who was born, they named Saeed again, which struck me as an extremely cruel and sort of, I had some humanist sensitivities back then, so my sentimentalism didn't allow me to understand it. I tried to romanticize it and think they were trying to preserve memory of their fallen child or something of that nature and give them more complex psychological motivations. It wasn't the case. When I had a grandfather, who was a great reader of poetry, a great teacher, a very wise figure who understood mysticism, who understood all kinds of things. When I turned to him and I said, "How could you name your next child 1 year later the same name as your dad from a year earlier?" His response was very coldly, "It was a good name." Now that strikes us as meaning this idea of not wasting a good name, strikes us perhaps in our humanist sort of modernity as callous or brutal. But in fact, it's very humble. It means that you don't waste. People who are in actual states of extreme crisis and deprivation, you don't waste a damn thing. And it would be to dishonor the power of the phenomenon and of the existential violence of the world itself, that just mere being is catastrophic, to try and preserve that name in some romantic, frozen state of untouchability. No, you recycle it and you use it again because you have to, and because you're up against something that is stronger than you. So anyway, that's what I wanted to sort of throw in there, those 3 dimensions.
Thank you so much. What I keep thinking is how, this classic idea that like natural history sort of like gave to like social history, and sort of like how it's like been like a return of the natural history. And I mean, we already knew climate change was a return of natural history, but it wasn't as concrete and as sort of like felt as a shock. But we really see this as this return of natural history, right? As you said, like, I think, was it you? Yeah, you said that the game is, we're not the game, it is the game. And what is the game? The game is natural history, is back to basically be the leading historical force. Yes, we're there too, but it's going to be interesting to see how, if you want to go Keatlerian, you would conceive of his history of techne as a separate one. So you will have like these three type of histories that are intertwined, right? The history of techne, the history which includes something like culture and all that, but and then you have the natural history, and then you have the social history, right? So it's sort of like this three-threaded sort of like history, and it's open-ended contingencies, which is always in three contingencies. You're dealing with three contingencies, because if you have these three, it also triples the contingency, not just the paths.
Absolutely, Mohammed. You know, also in our cinematic unconscious, even at the most popular level, look at how many dystopian films. We know this, we anticipate it intuitively. Look at how many of our dystopian genre films are about waking up in someone else's game, meaning Hunger Games or Maze Runner, or sort of, it's all these projections, or even in the horror genre, Saw, where, you know, that's a more diabolical and sadistic sort of gameplay. But it's waking up and sort of having to quickly acquaint yourself to the rules of another's game, who is often anonymous, faceless, or systemic. You know, at some levels. So I think we already knew this might be coming, this type of unique experience.
We want to like hear you guys, if you want to like have anyone has a comment or has a question for any of the people who spoke, you know, like there's quite a few people. So Valentin, do you want to say a few words?
I think Eric wants to ask a question. That's it.
Yeah, okay.
Is that okay?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. This whole idea of waking up in another one's, in another entity's process or whatever game, which is which is faceless and anonymous, who we can never know. How is this different from any idea of God? Or we can also supplant nature instead, like, okay, this is the a nude outburst of natural history. We cannot escape nature, blah blah. How is this different from God?
All right, sure. I can give you a more empirical and material example, so you don't see the metaphor. I've spent years studying prison poets, right? And the tactics that need to be instrumentally devised when you're in prison, when you're facing ritualistic torture, for instance, knowing the temporality, the spatiality, knowing about mock executions, which is a form of diabolical gameplay. You know, you could say that the guards, for all intents and purposes, are miniature gods, you know, but I don't think it has to happen in only a metaphysical province of imagination. I think anybody who wakes up in, you know, in Iranian prison cell or some dungeon somewhere realizes that they're dealing with overseers. You can read Jean Genet for that. You can read great, again, Middle Eastern prison poets, Nazim Hekmat, Ahmed Shamlou. They'll give you sort of captivating demonstrations of how you have to become strategic, even down to the most sort of twisted psychological level of inverting paradigms of pain and pleasure in a lot of ways. You know, it's a complex thing. You also, by the way, it's interesting, you can get back into just, Erica, here's another tangible example. Labyrinths really do exist. You know, outside of Borges' of them, labyrinths were an ancient form of torture by maniacal kings, by mad emperors often, and kings. And you can see them if you ever travel to North Africa and Tunisia and other places. And the idea of waking up in a labyrinth, or being flung or hurled into a labyrinth, which, you know, sort of, and then knowing that there's someone above watching this, it doesn't necessitate an omniscient sort of figure. Sort of games can be sort of self-enveloping and self-sustained, you know, even, I mean, that's the Foucauldian project in many ways. You know, you can have the architect, and then you can have the disappearance of the architect. The institution can run itself at some levels. That's also Nietzsche's Death of God. In a more sort of convoluted sense, you know, the world keeps spinning without the driver at the wheel. But at any rate, those are just my quick questions on a very complicated, good question.
I think this is a good place to end.
Federico also wanted to ask something.
Oh yeah, okay.
Just hello, everybody. Just a brief question to Jason about the game. And I was thinking about this element that you brought in about the mimesis, about how maybe this concept of human abstraction will eventually lead us to our own downfall, since it doesn't permit us to play the game. So I was thinking maybe if this mimesis can be used, like maybe I was thinking like in two polarities, maybe trying to, can we play the game by making a mimesis of this relative contingency that presents us with the coronavirus, this natural relative contingency, or should we rather become an insectoid? Let's say use the mimesis to become an insectoid in humanist rationality to combat the virus. I don't know what you think about these possibilities of the mimetic and the virus, like a strategy to play the game.
Absolutely. No, I mean, learning your so-called enemy or opposition's maneuvers is fundamental to martial arts, for instance. So if we wanted to even use a different paradigm of one of the choreography of martial arts, how it uses momentum, how it uses movement of the other, absolutely, there's a great mimetic sort of thing there. Dance also uses that in the best forms of dance. But there is something more dire and grave to the question, which is, almost every language on earth and almost every language in any civilization has the expression "gone too far." We've gone too far. And the difficult thing philosophically is to know when you cross that imperceptible barrier. When have we gone too far? Which is to say, when have we entered the domain of becoming the laws, which no moves on the board will matter. And this is actually something that Samuel Beckett already anticipated when he wrote a play called Endgame. And for those who don't know, an endgame is the moment when it's absolutely futile because you know who the winner is. You have one piece, one pawn that's sort of circulating, and they have a legion of pieces still on the board. And so what do? You just go through the last motions anyway. Rather than forfeiting or surrendering, you just play in this sort of aftermath, done already, and you're a goner, you're a lost cause. We don't even need Beckett. 1,000 years ago, great Arabian poets would talk about the moment when their horse would die in the desert. And at that moment, you're scorched earth. By dawn, you'll be dead. But it's fascinating. And even 14 miles from an oasis, 14 miles may as well be 14,000 miles in the desert territory. So what do? They walk anyway. It's an amazing sort of human instinct or reflex. You walk anyway. That's the end game. To what extent we're actually in the end game of this game, I don't know.
Thank you so much, Jason. We're hearing like people on YouTube have been enjoying your interjections. Valentin, what should we do? Reza never showed up. I don't know what happened. I never heard from him. So do you have any questions? Do you have any, you want to continue on, or should we say goodbye? And because we're kind of on time, it went for 2.5 hours.
I think it was a very lovely introduction of a lot of much more personal things, and we talked about for the whole thing. And even if we started by talking how virus interacts with our body, now we're talking about how we interact with the virus through games. I think it's a very, very important and interesting thing, and it would be sad to close right now, right?
I wanted to maybe, if it's okay, ask Mattin a question. And somehow I'm sure it's like everybody else probably like understood it properly, right? But I wanted to like connect what you began to speak with, which was total subsumption, all the way to sort of like the corona pandemic. Just a little quick, like how because you brought us through many steps to get there, right?
Yeah, and probably was too quickly and not too precise. So basically, it's the anticipation of social struggles that will come And then the question is like, what room to maneuver would this, given this, the conditions that we are talking about, the technological control, the governments are using all their power, we cannot socialize, what will be our room to maneuver? And this concept of real subsumption has been used precisely in order to try to find out, okay, to what extent has capitalism integrated our living labor, our capacity, our critical potential, and there is these perspectives that are quite totalizing, and they give you very, very small room to maneuver. And I guess, yeah, I was trying to make this differentiation between concrete in act and concrete in thought, and saying, okay, no, there is room to maneuver certainly in the practice, but the question is that we don't have conscious action to this practice. And I guess now trying to synthesize this form of reification that occurs at the conscious level in concrete in act makes it produce this self-conception, the liberal self-conception, that it can be autonomous, that it can express their freedom to a certain extent. So we see that that's kind of collapsing. That's at a very, last step. And then there something obviously might emerge, but what it could emerge, I have no idea. But I guess what it makes me is a bit, the way that it helps this concept of real subsumption, of how people have been using it, is to criticize, certain forms of politics, among others, that they offer programs, or like the social democratic perspectives. And that was where the Bernie Sanders kind of came in. So that's I hope that makes sense, right? Like, okay, so that's the kind of critique to the Bernie Sanders hopes that, what could they bring if they're based on a self-conception that is reified, and that would probably now implode in the next few whatever months or years.
I'm like, I began the program tonight by criticizing Sanders, or at least Sanders' team. So, but I think actually there were like really a lot of hopeful like moments, or like possibilities in the way actually a new kind of subject was being sort of like conceived throughout the campaign literature. It was really like there, I can point to it. So there was something going on in terms of like, how can we define individual or collective in that moment? But I mean, we know it didn't go anywhere, at least at the electoral level. So I'll give the Sanders' campaign that it, with the help of AOC. I mean, I was there in New York when Sanders and AOC appeared to basically for AOC to announce her support of his candidacy, and in both of those people speaking, both Sanders and AOC, there were many points where like it was an alternative to the liberal subject was almost there to be grasped. So I just wanted to like note that, because I think it's important to kind of like go back to that and try to build something from that, because that was at least kind of like achieved by these people, if nothing else. I mean, Sanders talks about how the socialism won the ideological battle, even though we didn't win the nomination. And I think there's a bit of a point in that, but I think he's like overplaying that point, because what is the purpose of this ideological win if at the level of electoral politics, where you raised millions of dollars, way more than Joe Biden actually, could not kind of like compete? Anyways, like we can go on. A lot of like stuff is unresolved, but like there's always the following weeks and some more reflections and some more sort of like experience of the world in order to think and all that. So I think it's a good place to maybe say good night and like say thanks to everyone who kind of like participated and everyone else who's been watching on YouTube and all that. And hope to see a lot of you back soon with more. We're gonna like have some other guests for the following week. And then on the 22nd, me and my friend Adnan will be doing a kind of like a more specific gathering that deals with the art and the place of art. And Jason, of course, you'll be invited because you had a lot of amazing insights to bring into this question and others. Yeah, so see you guys next week.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. It was a pleasure.